My pleasure to welcome Professor Prabhu Guptara, who's visiting us here from Switzerland. He's a distinguished professor of global business management and public policy at William Carey University in India. He's a member of the board of the Institute of Management at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. And he spends most of his time helping boards of companies and organizations deal with both strategic and market-related issues. But one of the things that you will not find here, and thanks to Wikipedia, it turns out that he's also a poet. But I guess it's been a while, hasn't it? So he's actually written a lot of books on religion, culture, spirituality, and he has 2 volumes of his own poems. And he's going to talk today about the interaction between public policy and philanthropy, and it's going to be a comparison between the United States and India. So would you please join me in welcoming Professor Guptara.
So I thought we might go for sort of 40 minutes, 45 minutes of input from me, and then we'll have, depending on how long you want to go, up to 45 minutes for discussion. So first of all, many thanks to Professor Mahbubani and the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy for inviting me to come and speak, and to Dr. Lal for graciously accepting to chair the event in Dr. Mahbubani's absence. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, and I'm glad to have the opportunity of dialogue with you today. Let me begin with the USA. Philanthropy, or what they probably would have called brotherly love, marked the early settlement of the North American continent by Europeans, at least so far as the majority, that is the Puritans and other dissenters from the British and continental European systems were concerned. They faced an unfamiliar, sometimes hostile environment, and had fled persecution and oppression in the old world. That was the result of public policy in relation to a philanthropic people. Not surprisingly, the colonial society of the New World was marked by a culture of collaboration, or what the French observer Alexis de Tocqueville called voluntary associations, or private initiatives for public good. He noted that such associations were a key to understanding American democracy. Americans did not rely on government or aristocracy, or indeed any established religion to address social problems. Rather, they addressed the problems themselves, jointly. In other words, philanthropy was characteristic of American democracy and was, until relatively recent times, entirely centered on their non-established and highly competitive churches. One of the first, if not the first, voluntary association was also the first American government, of course, the Mayflower Compact of 1620. The Pilgrims, still not quite landed for the first time on American soil, declared that they, and I quote, solemnly and mutually, in the presence of God and one another, combine ourselves into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation. The very first corporation in the USA, Harvard College, founded in 1636, and now the undergraduate part of Harvard University, was a philanthropic voluntary association created to train young men to become preachers and spiritual leaders. 3 of the leading English colonies of the time, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, were called commonwealths. That is, they aimed to be idealistic societies in which each and every member contributed to the commonwealth, the public good. Here, philanthropy and public policy were intended to coalesce. The main promoters of this ideal were, of course, the spiritual leaders of these communities, and we must remember that Puritans dominated America for at least the first 100 years. One of the leading preachers, Cotton Mather, established a multitude of societies for community projects and published more than 400 books, One of them in 1770, a book so widely read that it became an American classic, Bonner Facius, or An Essay to Do Good, which urges the financing of useful publications and the founding of schools, libraries, and hospitals. The book was not addressed to rich people in order to encourage them to help poor people. No, the book encouraged everyone to help others. Each for all and all for each, as the traditional Swiss motto expresses the biblical idea, much more bruited abroad though the phrase was, as a result of Alexander Dumas' later novel, The Three Musketeers. Prominent Americans, such as Benjamin Franklin, were deeply influenced by Mather's book, and they deliberately oriented their lives around public service. And charity, philanthropy, voluntary organizations, and mutual respect marked the generality of Americans, at least in their relations with each other. Even Franklin's political rival, John Adams, said publicly in France that there was hardly anyone who did not consider Franklin, and I quote, a friend to humankind. In Philadelphia, Franklin created what was probably the first interdenominational organization for philanthropy in America, modeled on the self-organizing Christian congregations which created that culture in America. Franklin's Junto, or Leather Apron Club, as it was called, met each week to discuss moral, political, and scientific topics and to exchange intelligence on business affairs. Franklin used the club to generate and test philanthropic ideas, while he used his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, to interrogate and mobilize public support, raise funds, and recruit volunteers. That modus operandi produced America's first subscription library in 1731, and then a volunteer fire association, a fire insurance association, the American Philosophical Society, an academy which eventually became what is today the University of Philadelphia, a hospital for which funds were raised by means of what may have been the world's very first challenge grant, the paving and patrolling of public streets, and the finance and construction of a town hall. In 1747, when the Pennsylvanian colony was affected by conflicts with Native Americans in the West and with French-Canadian privateers in the lower Delaware River, at a time when the government was Quaker and therefore pacifist, Franklin published Plain Truth, which pointed out that Pennsylvania was defenseless unless people were willing to take matters in their own hands and form a military association. The appeal raised £6,500, the association was formed, and it was not only approved by the town council, its officers were even commissioned by the council president. Franklin's actions present to us the prototypical US approach to philanthropy. Individual initiative, drawing together a band of people, in his case deliberately diverse people, to support the initiative, not merely taking up what the government was not expected or able or willing for whatever reason to do, but even challenging the government. In the way that he invested in and used the Pennsylvania Chronicle and the Pennsylvania Gazette, Franklin, along with his business partners, can be considered one of the first social entrepreneurs, at least in the US. We could go on to detail the whole history of the relationship between American society, volunteerism, philanthropy, the role of Protestant preachers in creating a sense of national identity, and the founding and commencement of what eventually became the USA that we know today. We could talk about the Minutemen, the Colonial Army, the Sons of Liberty, the Declaration of Independence, Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Papers, and all the rest of it. But at present, I will only say this. Every public policy reform in the history of the United States, whether against slavery or for women's suffrage, civil rights, the education reform, peace movements, judicial reform, public housing, healthcare, environmental conservation, began with voluntary philanthropic associations challenging the status quo. However, A different kind of institution, charitable foundations, came into prominence in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, endowed by people who had utilized the opportunities for making unprecedented wealth through business. Starting with the very first foundation in the US fully dedicated to addressing major national policy issues, the Peabody Education Fund in 1867. Such foundations have been involved in a much more systematic way in public policy making, using the influence of their elite boards, molding public opinion by campaigns of public information and education, creating demonstration projects, using their own funds to leverage public funds, direct lobbying, and of course using legal means. In America, you don't get very far if you don't use legal means. It doesn't matter what it's about. Though initially few, foundations had by the middle of the 20th century increased greatly in number, in wealth, in activity, and in impact. However, the later ones, such as Sage, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Rosenwald, Commonwealth foundations, focused on trying to make philanthropy both more efficient and more scientific. All of these foundations engage so deeply with government that the entire history of the public sector is impossible to understand if we don't keep that in mind. Indeed, the development of what Ellen Lagerman called in 1989 the politics of knowledge crystallized as knowledge of various kinds became more and more essential to economic activity and to the formulation, implementation, and evaluation of public policy. These philanthropic developments emerged symbiotically with the development of the large-scale national state of the 19th century. Now, in spite of all that, foundations have been regarded with suspicion from the first warnings sounded by the founding fathers about privately endowed associations, right down to the various congressional investigations in the 18th century that have examined foundation power and influence, starting in the 1910s with the investigations of Rockefeller philanthropy by the Walsh Commission on Industrial Relations, and continuing with the congressional inquiries of Cox and Rees in the 1950s and Patman in the 1960s. These culminated in the Tax Reform Act of 1969, which has been criticized for raising the cost of compliance and of being based on expectations of an unrealistic rate of return on foundation capital. That and subsequent legal and administrative changes, including those that followed 9/11, have apparently not been enough for the opponents of philanthropic foundations. And there is, as some of you will know, right now, a fresh effort to squeeze non-profits, including churches, for taxes, if that's possible. Where that move goes, of course, remains to be seen. Meanwhile, the Tax Reform Act of 1969 itself needs to be seen as part of a wider change in the US. Something radical happened around the 1970s to change the nature of America's, and eventually the world's, economy and society. Jeff Foe, in his book, The Global Class War, How America's Bipartisan Elite Lost Our Future, puts it this way. Essentially, America's super rich found a way to conspire with the political class and the chattering class to attack democracy and exploit the rest of society. The revolt began in the 1950s, led by William F. Buckley Jr., who founded the National Review and gathered around him the devotees of Ayn Rand, Irving Kristol, Norman Podhoretz, and Milton Friedman. They were revolting against the earlier social compact represented by the New Deal, according to which the rich got a fair share of the profits while providing a minimum social safety net for the poor in terms of income, medical care, and education. The right-wing revolt gained political and cultural respectability when the Republican Party was able to draw into its tent not only these economic neoconservatives, but also morally and socially conservative activists. The Republican Party was then able to hide the fundamental contradiction between the interests of social conservatives and corporate investors. Social conservatives wanted to use the government to limit the freedom of individuals to pursue their hedonistic interests, The latter, corporate investors, wanted the government to facilitate the stimulation and commercialization of exactly the same instincts. The organizing genius of the conservative Republicans was to compartmentalize the two opposing value systems so that they reinforced each other against what was perceived to be a common liberal enemy. The social conservatives would bring grassroots energy, corporations would provide the money. This seemingly impossible coalition achieved its crowning success with the Reagan Revolution, whose purpose was clearly not to eliminate government influence on the economy. It was to use government influence in order to shift the distribution of income and wealth upward and roll back the power of popular democracy to constrain the prerogatives of the corporate elite. The most radical idea, sponsored by President Reagan, later of course promoted by the elder George Bush, was the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, covering Canada, the USA, and Mexico, which promoted privatization, deregulation, and the freedom to pursue profit anywhere in the world in order to trump the cause of building a just society at home. The purpose of NAFTA was not to make the constituent nations more competitive or wealthy, it was to make the North American corporate investors more competitive and wealthy by giving them access to cheap labor and to government assets across the three countries. Though neither Reagan nor the elder Bush was able to push NAFTA through a Democrat-controlled Congress, Democratic President Bill Clinton did push NAFTA through, reneging on his electoral promise to oppose NAFTA if it did not have adequate social and environmental protections. Why did Clinton deliver the Democratic Party to a business agenda and support NAFTA rules designed by his political adversaries to allow their constituencies to get more while his own got less? Because Clinton had gone out to raise money from business for the 1992 elections, for which he received at least $853,000 from the financial industry alone. And he thus began to identify with the agenda of the elite. Once Clinton was in the White House and started delivering on the agenda, the coffers opened up for him and for his party. In the campaign of 2000, the Democrats raised $340 million from business, while Labor's contribution to the party was $52 million. Clinton's betrayal of the American people, writes Foe, thus reflected the complex interaction of money, ambition, power, and ideology that drives both Democrats and Republicans to try to shape the future of global society around a social model in which the corporate investor is king. NAFTA established common protection and rights for multinational corporate investors, including patent protection, banking regulations, and the right to challenge environmental laws, while the provisions on labor and the environment were little more than admonitions to each nation to enforce its own laws. No common standards were set. Any of the three nations could eliminate the minimum wage, outlaw unions, dismantle health and safety standards, or loosen instructions on the industrial pollution of air and water at will. NAFTA thus entrenched a division between those who could make money by investing somewhere else and those whose job, business, or concern for society or the environment was stuck in America. Clinton's contempt for democracy is evident from a Gallup poll at the time, which showed that 65% of Americans opposed the agreement and only 28% were for it. Not surprisingly, NAFTA has been a resounding success for NAFTA's elite. It has been a substantial success for the next 9% or so of the NAFTA area population, while the middle classes have lost so slowly that they didn't even notice it till the crash of 2002, 2007 and 8, fed as they were the illusion that they benefit from rising house prices while the real purchasing power of their incomes declined. The usual propaganda by the global elite is that inequality is the price a society must pay for increased social mobility arising from greater economic opportunity. The governing class never seems to tire of telling Americans how lucky they are compared with the citizens of Western Europe, who are so protected from competition that they have no incentive to succeed. Yet, although the United States had the highest level of income inequality among all advanced societies, a children born to poverty actually has a greater chance of moving up the class ladder in Western Europe and Canada than in the United States. The immediate cause of reduced economic mobility in the United States has been the closing off of avenues of escape from low-wage jobs. The traditional job paths into the middle class, unionized industrial jobs, unskilled government service have of course shrunk, while opportunities for further upward mobility have declined. Rising costs have priced people with lower income out of the market for a college education, which has of course been the springboard for the next generation. However, NAFTA was only the proving ground for a wider attack on democracy around the world in the shape of the World Trade Organization, which similarly entrenches corporate rights while neglecting environment and minimum wage requirements. The NAFTA financial model, liberalization of trade and finance, leading to a speculative bubble and a subsequent crash, and the protection of investors from the consequences of their own actions was repeated in various forms in the 1990s. Thailand, Brazil, Bolivia, South Korea, Indonesia, Russia, Argentina. We also saw a repeat of this performance following the global crash of 2007-8, which is not surprising since the aim of preserving the system in a way that benefits those who make the economic mistakes has been a bipartisan affair among the economic and political elites. There are such things as structures of freedom, of equity and justice, and I suppose there are such things as structures of sin. We can argue about whether it was structures of sin that led to the unprecedented global boom, which had its bust in 2007-8, but the fact is that the bust led to a retreat from globalization, resulting right now in the tensions over currency devaluations, because everyone with even a modicum of knowledge of economics or history understands that currency devaluations are a sort of last gasp, which, if they fail, leaves only the final option, which is war. Fo's book places before the intelligent American philanthropist uncomfortable questions. Should philanthropists support the policy aims of the economic elite, or should they rather help to shape a global order that embodies something that is minimally just for everyone and extends citizens' rights to minimum levels of health, safety, conditions of work, transparency in government, education, food free from contamination, and minimum levels of clean air and water? Now, the amount of giving continues to go up in the USA in spite of all the difficulties of the last 6 years or so, to $298 billion in 2011, the last for which figures that I have available. The current mission, led by the likes of Buffett, Gates, Bono, and so on, to make large-scale philanthropy the norm among the super-rich, has just, as reported yesterday, won a dozen new converts. Forbes magazine records 1,223 billionaires, of whom 102, just under 10%, have now signed up to giving away at least half their wealth. But as important as giving is the question of what they are giving to or for. While Bono, Buffett, and Gates focus on other wholly admirable humanitarian objectives related to fighting disease, you would expect others, such as George Soros, because of personal background, to understand very easily which class went to war, with what strategy, and won with what effects, and the nature of the crony capitalism that has emerged in the United States, crony capitalism that one does not expect to see in any developed country, but only in banana republics or third world dictatorships. It was, I put to you, moral collapse in the US, which led to the global collapse of 2007-8, from which we have still not escaped. And I greatly doubt that anything short of a moral revolution among the elite is going to reverse the trend in the US in any decisive fashion. But that group of philanthropists is not engaged at present, perhaps does not even see these sorts of things at present. Dear colleagues, that is all I have time to cover in considering the trajectory of a nation founded idealistically, which struggled with the realities of settling in a continent in the face of numerous challenges, and of creating the world's first free nation out of two fundamentally opposed organizing principles: selfishness and philanthropy, idealism and realpolitik, and what benefits everyone versus what benefits primarily a certain class or group. At present, the forces of selfishness, of realpolitik, seem to be dominant. However, US history has seen the pendulum swing from one conglomeration of attitudes and philosophies to the other, and back again. As what is still the lead economy and society of the world, what happens there is not merely a matter of interest or even a portent, it is still a decisive influence on what happens all over the world. So we must wish them well and pray that moral and humanitarian attitudes will rise there once again. But we must also understand the character and nature of the humanitarian forces which made the USA. So, in order to do that, I recommend to you Vishal Mangalwadi's The Book That Made the World. I'll repeat the title of the book That Made the World, by a man called Mangalwadi. By the way, I have references to all these books, and if you're interested, you can just drop me a mail, look up my website, drop me a mail, and I can send you the bibliographical details, the details of the books. I now turn my attention to India. This year, 2013, is the 150th birth anniversary of Swami Vivekananda's birth. An appropriate time to state what has so far not been stated in the scholarly literature. That is, that Vivekananda's influence helped to entirely transform Indian philanthropy. Indeed, it may not even be appropriate to term as philanthropy what we had in India up to that point in history. Dana, or giving, was directed principally towards gods, temples, and priests. After Swami Vivekananda's impact, India's giving has slowly but increasingly turned to needy human beings through disaster relief in terms of famine, plague, flood, and through orphan care, hospitals, and schools, specifically the education of lower caste boys, though it is clear that the establishment of Vivekananda's organization, the Ramakrishna Mission, owed a huge amount to the moral and financial support of India's British rulers at the time. A fascinating story which has not been properly explored so far in terms of what arguments were presented by the British ruling class in India for and against such support, who the respective exponents of these arguments were, why the sympathetic lobby won, how much was actually given, and so on. Now, all this does not mean that there was no philanthropy in India earlier. Vivekananda's ideas go back not, as is ignorantly assumed, so much to his guru, Ramakrishna Paramahansa, but rather to a man called Shashipada Banerjee, who had an early commitment to social service. Swami Ramakrishna Paramahansa, Vivekananda's guru, had no such commitment. In fact, he mocked attempts at social service, famously in the case of his encounter with the 19th century Bengali luminary Christodas Paul, the editor of the weekly Hindu Patriot. Banerjee, the actual inspiration behind Vivekananda's efforts, had become a member of the Brahma Samaj in 1865 and later established the Sadharan Dharma Sabha in 1873, just before Vivekananda made his own first real commitment to social service in 1874. In any case, when I say that Vivekananda's efforts transformed Indian philanthropy, I mean that what was just before him the quirk of an individual or a clique increasingly came to mark, as a result of his efforts and the efforts of his followers in the Ramakrishna Mission, the thinking and philanthropic actions and efforts of more and more Hindus. Historians of ideas regretfully often make the mistake of being so besotted with where an idea first appeared that they forget to ask the sociological question, when did an idea first become popular? Let us cast an eye back to some of the historical milestones that led up to the Swami's transformation of Indian philanthropy. In India's ahistorical or non-historical culture, it is common to imagine that Indian culture is eternal, that things have always been the way they are now. But this is simply not true. Even those who have lived only to my age, 64, have seen enormous changes firsthand, specifically in our religious and cultural traditions. And if our parents have shared even their least important memories on such subjects with us, then it will be clear that there's been a sea change in our spiritual life, even within the lifespan of 2 generations. Further, there is the evidence of our own religious texts, from which we know that Vedic religion, the most ancient strand that we are aware of, consisted principally of singing hymns in praise of God or the gods, and of making non-vegetarian sacrifices in order to seek the blessing of these gods. And by blessing was meant wealth, power, and fame, along with victory in battle, naturally with the loot that is consequent upon it. At some point was added the idea of occasional charity or alms-giving. However, the Vedic or Brahminic tradition, which has a sort of transactional relationship with the gods, I'm doing this for you, will you do this for me, was challenged by 2 forces. On the one hand, it was challenged by the Shramaniks, we call them yogis or ascetics today, who rely primarily on self-effort by austerity or some normally painful or at least physically challenging limitation or contortion, which we call tapas, even though the idea of the grace of the gods may be involved, particularly in later versions of Shramanic traditions. Apart from the establishment of yoga, the developing Shramanic traditions in almost every way opposed the Brahminic tradition, and led first to the establishment of what is today called Jainism, a very small minority religion with a huge cultural influence, which, so far from begging favors for enhancing prosperity and happiness on the earth, locates the notion of spirituality in the total abnegation and abandonment not only of prosperity but of life itself. One of the reasons why it's such a minority sport today. It was at one time huge in the country, dominated half the country. Jain prayers are decidedly not for wealth, power, fame, or other worldly things, as are Vedic prayers. Jain emphasis is on humility, introspection, kindness, equality, self-fulfillment through service of others, forgiveness, and other internal emotional or spiritual qualities. The other direction from which Brahminic tradition was challenged was by the highly commonsensical, pragmatically and psychologically oriented tradition originating with the Buddha, which emphasized and emphasizes the middle way between, on the one hand, the obsessive orientation towards victory in battle and this worldly prosperity presented to us by the Vedas, and on the other hand, the extremely life-denying philosophy of Jainism. Though it was Jainism that originated many of the ideas such as vegetarianism, care for animals, reincarnation, and so on, it was the middle way of Buddhism that produced, in the reign of the Buddhist Emperor Ashoka, 3rd century BC, the first large-scale and possibly empire-wide examples of care for environment, care for animals, tree-lined roads between major towns with reasonably and regularly spaced drinking water for travelers, and so on. There was also much more widespread education than there had been in the case of Vedic society. And Buddhist education, unlike Vedic education, did not discriminate on the basis of caste. In the ancient Buddhist universities, including Takshila, Nalanda, Udantapuri, and so on, this was actually the case. And they were large, massive universities. Not only were they massive, they also made fundamental contributions to mathematics, to medical science, and so on. And I've written elsewhere that the fame of these universities was one of the reasons why Alexander the Great wanted to come and conquer India. In fact, when he came to conquer India, he did not only bring an army, he brought with him historians, astrologers, medics, doctors, and so on, so that they could meet and talk with the yogis, who were called gymnosophists by the Greeks at that time, in these Buddhist universities. Now, the interesting question is this: was the care for the environment, for animals, and for humans a case of royal philanthropy? Or was it merely sensible state policy? In any case, this marks the first case in Indian history of the convergence of philanthropy and public policy. In any case, the contributions of Buddhists and Jains appear to have been undone by two developments. First, the rise of Tantra, and second, by the rise of Shankaracharya's non-dualism, Advaita. Shankaracharya, 8th to 9th century AD, was the main force, intellectual, organizational, and as far as we can make out, physical, that disestablished Buddhism as well as Jainism in India, enfeebling these powerful religions and so making the Indian kingdoms ripe to fall to Muslim and other invaders. Be that as it may, Muslims did arrive in India, first as traders and then as rapacious hordes which attacked temples and monasteries wherever they might have hoards of gold and stores worth attacking. At a time when the ideological assertion of Neo-Hinduism of the sort advocated by the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh and the Vishwa Hindu Parishad is reaching new heights, it is worth emphasizing that the motivation of the invaders, whether pagan white Huns from Russia or Muslim Mongols, Afghans, Persians, Central Asians or Turks, was not ideological or religious. They did not destroy, for example, all the small temples that they came across, which would have cost them almost nothing in terms of time and effort. Rather, their motivation was purely material. They concentrated on urban centers and on the large temples and monasteries where gold and other treasures were concentrated, as witnessed down to our own day. You may recollect the devotes of the 16th century Sri Padmanabha Swami temple in Trivandrum, Kerala, were discovered to have gold, diamonds and precious stones possibly worth $62 billion, whose existence had till then not been known except to a very few temple priests and trustees. The Tirumala temple in eastern Andhra Pradesh is reported to have 3,000 kilograms of gold alone, a third of which it deposited with the State Bank of India in 2010. The total wealth in all our temples, in spite of all the looting that took place, in spite of all that, the total wealth in our temples has never been computed. Whatever we may think about the continuing impact of Vedic or Brahminic religion in terms of the accumulation of gold, diamonds and precious stones in our temples, and whatever may be our attitude to the destruction of these extremely wealthy temples and monasteries by marauding hordes from the 8th century onwards, India was in equal measure blessed and cursed by having Muslim kings and emperors from about that time. Most outstandingly, of course, the Mughal emperors of India from the 16th century. Under the religiously tolerant Akbar, the country flourished materially and culturally, primarily due to sound fiscal, monetary and infrastructural policies. Roads were built, there was a stable currency and a sensible policy on taxation and expenditure. As was the case under the Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century BC, philanthropy appears to have been unnecessary, while such macro conditions existed in Akbar's reign in the 16th century AD. Akbar's rule was a contrast to the very intolerant Islamic policy followed by his own great-grandson, Aurangzeb, from whose adventures the empire never recovered. However, it is worth reminding our contemporary Hindu zealots that the Mughal Empire was not finally destroyed by Shivaji and other Hindus, most of whom were very happy to collaborate with the Mughals, and indeed with all other invaders, including the French and the British. The Mughal Empire had its death blow at the hands of a fellow Muslim, the Afghan Ahmad Shah Durrani, and the coup de grace was eventually delivered by another group of foreigners, of course, the British. Meanwhile, Islam had become thoroughly established all over the country, and its impact on philanthropy in India has never been properly studied, though there have been magisterial studies of Muslim philanthropy in Egypt, the institution of the Waqf in Central Asia over 400 years, of politics and charity in the Ottoman Empire, and actually even in relation to our own times. As I've said, I've got a list of books in relation to all this if you're interested. The collapse of the Mughals provides a convenient point at which to transition to the first phase of the British engagement with India up to roughly 1813, which was characterized by none other than Lord Macaulay as being equivalent to a gang of public robbers. In other words, the British up to 1813 matched, if they did not outdo, all the previous robbers, pillagers and exploitative rulers of the country, whether native or foreign. The East India Company Act of 1813 transformed the company from the aforesaid gang of robbers into a civilizing force because of the efforts of British evangelicals. The Act provided for freedom of thought in allowing missionaries into India for the first time in 200 years of British rule. And it provided public funds for education, provided funds separately for the revival of Indian literature and for the promotion of science. We may or may not agree with the evangelicals, but it was their philanthropic efforts which led to changes not only in public policy, but in the entire character of the British Raj in India. Eventually, it is to the evangelicals that credit is due for the introduction of modern education in India, the place of the English language in India, the constitution of the country, its judicial system, the creation of a merit-based Indian administrative service, which served India so admirably till Mrs. Gandhi's emergency in 1975 to 77 systematically subverted it. Ultimately, the very independence of India was foreseen by the evangelicals, and the ground for Indian independence was prepared by them. Of course, independence was not given to India as a gift by the evangelicals, whether in India or in Britain, but they did help, along with the utilitarians and the Orientalists, to lay the foundations which led to the creation of a sense of national identity for the first time, and ultimately to the struggle for independence. But it was also evangelical-induced public policy in India that created the pattern of Indian reaction, which still marks India and can be divided into four tendencies. The first of these is clearly secularist, starting in the 1830s, typified by individuals who publicly discarded the sacred thread, the most significant mark of belonging to the upper castes, refused to swear by the water of the holy Ganges, established modern libraries, donated land for the very first institution of higher education for women in India, and caused a sensation by refusing to marry child brides, as was the tradition. Today, by far the largest number of Indian philanthropists are, I hazard, secularists, led among others by Azim Premji, theoretically, of course, a Muslim. I'm not casting aspersions on his Islam. I'm just saying that as a philanthropist, he's not Muslim in a narrow sense. Narayan Murthy, of course, who is Hindu. Again, I'm not casting aspersions on his Hinduism. He's just not narrowly Hindu in his philanthropy. And Ratan Tata. Actually, all Parsi business leaders, as the whole of the community turned towards a secular or Protestantized sort of direction around the 1830s. If the secularists are the largest group to emerge from the impact of Protestant modernization, the second group, and perhaps the second largest, were and are those who wish radically to reform Hindu society in the light of Western moral and rational ideals. Such reformers range from the Brahma Samaj and the Prarthana Samaj to Mahatma Jyotibhai Phule, the founder of the Satya Shodhak Samaj, Society of Seekers of Truth, and pioneer with his wife Savitri Bai of women's education in Western India. And Baba Sahib B.R. Ambedkar, the chief architect of India's constitution, as well as to not only the various official communist parties in India, which have reigned from time to time, you may remember, in 3 different Indian states, but also in the form of the dreaded Naxalites, followers of a movement that came to birth in 1967, influenced by Maoist thought, and according to V.K. Singh, the former Indian Army chief, affecting by 1990 50 out of the 640 districts in India. But as of January this year, now affecting 270 out of the 640 districts in the country, so well over a third of the country. So secularists, reformers, and the third are the defendants of the old traditions, who are tempered by reform, such as the Arya Samaj, the Radha Swami Satsang, Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, and Yoga Guru Baba Ramdev. In the RSS and the VHP, we have examples of movements that are so totally tempered by reform that they wish to entirely remake Hindu society and polity in their own image, being unprepared to tolerate or even acknowledge the existence of other forms of Hindu thought and practice. So secularists, reformers, defendants of Indian tradition. And then fourth, there are those who wish to defend the old in almost every particular. We may call them conservative defenders. The earliest stirring of that new spirit of conservative defense started in and around Calcutta with the publication in 1872 of Raj Narayan Bose's book, the superiority of Hinduism over all other forms of faith. A few years later, the Hindus of South India began to move in the same direction. But the man who's really interesting in this context is, of course, Ramakrishna Paramahansa, the guru of Swami Vivekananda. What distinguished his message from the teaching of other Indian gurus and so on before that was his defense of everything Hindu, which was predictable, but also his theory that all religions are true, which had never been asserted before that. This gave his teaching a universalistic tinge and provided the ordinary Hindu with the defense which he could use to meet both Christian criticism, which, remember, through the 19th century had been extremely fierce, which is why a Hindu reaction had been what it was, and rising reformist movements such as Brahma Samaj. The genius of his most famous disciple, Swami Vivekananda, lay in marrying the universalistic ideas of his guru with the strange, to us Indians at that time, idea of social service. Farquhar, writing in 1914, observed that the work of the Ramakrishna Mission, which Vivekananda founded, of course, has grown slowly since Vivekananda's death. There have been no such results as one would have expected to spring from the unbounded enthusiasm with which the Swami was welcomed when he returned from America after his talk at the Parliament of World Religions in 1893. He summoned his countrymen to practical service, to self-sacrificing work for India. Had the myriads which acclaimed him really responded to his call, the work would soon have attained very great dimensions. But the truth is that ancient Hinduism does not teach the duty of service at all. And that all that the average educated Hindu wants is to get somebody to assure him that Hinduism is as good as Christianity and that he does not need to become a Christian. Having heard this, amidst the flare of trumpets with which Vivekananda returned from America, the average man gave a sigh of relief and returned to his vegetating life as an ordinary Hindu. Vivekananda's call to self-sacrificing service was another of those troublesome appeals which they'd heard over and over again from missionaries and Brahma leaders. And they paid no more attention to it. Only a few responded. And these continue to carry on that work. However, even by that time, the impact of Vivekananda, especially abroad, but also in India, was that the Hindu, the Jain, the Buddhist, the Parsi, and the Muslim, and I quote Farquhar again, are today filled with overflowing confidence, each in his own religion, a confidence which tends to be hostile to spiritual life, as well as to a reasonable estimation of the old faiths. Many a man has a pride in his tone and shows an arrogance towards outsiders which are scarcely characteristic of health, whether religious or intellectual. The Modern Review, perhaps the best and most representative of the monthlies at present, 1914 when Farquhar is writing, frequently contains, he says, a good deal of bombast, and the youthful graduates who speak and write on Hinduism have usually far too much of Vivekananda's swagger about them. Hundreds of men of the student class believed that the ancient Hindus were as far advanced in the natural sciences as modern Europeans are, and that they had invented not only firearms and locomotives, but telegraphs and aeroplanes as well. Yet, says Farquhar, quite rightly, the arrival of the new spirit was necessary for the health of the country. In those few sentences, Farquhar reveals that Vivekananda's influence was not confined to the Ramakrishna Mission alone, but combined with the motive force of other Hindu revivalist movements, from the Vaishnava sects to the Shaiva sects and the Tantrics and even the Smartas. Caste organizations and caste conferences were initiated or strengthened as a result of the awakening that took place in the 19th and early 20th centuries. All these streams converged around Mahatma Gandhi, who understood the potential and tensions of these tendencies intuitively. Master politician that he was, he attempted to steer a path between his conscience and these forces to be able to do what was necessary to win independence for India. This sadly created the backlash of the partition of British India into Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. India adopted a constitution, becoming a secular country oriented against caste discrimination. But some 66 years after independence, it is clear from recent incidents that the forces of reaction against such values are alive and well, while corruption dogs almost every aspect of life in our country. Meanwhile, citizens inside India, as well as the vastly greater number of philanthropic Indians outside India, do all the usual things from philanthropic activity, from charitable to philanthropic activity. The amount of charity has grown by leaps and bounds. It has grown 50% between 2006 and 2011, according to one analysis. Though it is still only 0.6% of GDP, greater than the charitable giving in BRIC countries, but several leagues below 2.2% of GDP that is contributed in the USA, where 65% of people donate money, though 25% of those giving charitable donations are too poor to be taxed. In India, there's an amazing and increasing amount being done to help the illiterates, the jobless, the ill-fed, the starving, the sick, the dying. Education is the most popular cause, but how much of so-called educational philanthropy is in fact land grab? How much is mere public relations? And how much is capitalistic propaganda rather than sound and balanced study of economic and social truths? India has moved from nationalism through socialism to capitalism, but each has been subverted by selfish people to their own ends. To a certain extent, of course, that happens everywhere. The question is, to what extent it is now happening under the guise of philanthropy? Even in the case of genuine philanthropists, there is a blindness to the key issues facing the nation, which are corruption, inefficiency, laziness, the politicization now of everything, including corruption, rape, murder, and caste-based atrocity. The stridency and increasing violence on the part of political competitors, leading to what is now more or less policy and administrative paralysis in large parts of the country. Which means that the most essential thing, the future of the nation as a nation, is escaping attention, or is perhaps perceived as being a too big a problem to be solved, or even to be addressed. We have seen that the move from charity to philanthropy took place starting in India around the 1880s, and that it has moved more and more in the direction of philanthropy since then. Interestingly, that move from charity to philanthropy took place at almost exactly the same time as the move to what has come to be called scientific philanthropy in the USA. In the last 2 or 3 decades, however, philanthropy in the USA has delivered, alongside public benefit, a society increasingly divided between the rich and the poor, as well as between ideological extremes, and in danger of freezing into capitalism of a crony sort. In India too, philanthropy had a splendid start, creating the national identity and financing the very movement that led to the creation of India. Most of the country's achievements, from land reform to its membership of the nuclear and space clubs, as well as its striking achievements in information technology, can be traced back directly to the efforts of its philanthropists. After a hiatus of half a century, in which nothing substantially new was achieved, we now see a fresh flowering of Indian philanthropy. According to at least one study, from 2.3% of the wealth of rich individuals in 2010 to 3.1% of the wealth in 2011. Though, of course, that contrasts with rich Americans giving an average of 9.1%. This time, the flowering is not under the influence of Christianity, but under the influence of modernity. And interestingly, of course, that influence too came from the USA. These newly promising forms of Indian philanthropy have simply followed in the wake of developments, as they have always done, from abroad. And, as in the USA, may sooner or later tend to strengthen the trend towards crony capitalism in India too. And of course, the question is whether Indian philanthropy is ready to throw off the mantle of its tutelage from abroad and take over the global leadership of philanthropy's civilizing mission, where US philanthropy left off a few decades ago. India has been roused from a slumber, prodded into action, and thoroughly tutored by the West. As the West seems to be headed off in the direction of inhumanity and immorality, the question is whether the West will return to the path of virtue and philanthropy, or whether India will perhaps throw off that ancient tutelage and accept the mantle to move in a direction which will put India, as it did at the time of independence, at the head of the non-aligned movement, now at the head of philanthropy's civilizing mission. Thank you very much.
Hi, Crystal Haling. Thank you very much. Very, very interesting talk. I'm interested to hear your perspective of the Gates Challenge. And you gave a little bit of an inkling, but do you think that there is an effort there to turn towards, as you said, kind of the moral imperative?
Yes.
Or do you think it is primarily window dressing, or is it just insignificant in the issues that it's approaching? I mean, I'm just interested to hear where you place this in the category of the types of philanthropy you described.
Yes, thank you, Carol. It's obviously an extremely significant initiative. And as I said, Forbes counts 1,223 philanthropists in 2011, of whom 102 have signed this Buffett-Gates pledge to give away at least 50% of their philanthropy. So it's extremely significant. The question is, what are they giving to? If they're giving to simply eliminating illiteracy, that's great. If they're giving to eliminating malaria or other incurable, that's wonderful. Obviously, it needs to be done. But the question is, if at the same time the global system is going in a direction which simply increases environmental pollution, stress and strain on the part of people, which increases heart disease, creates greater income gaps between the rich and the poor, and therefore creates a kind of situation which is ripe for social revolution, is it really significant? In other words, it's well motivated, it's not, as far as I can tell. It's well motivated, it's not window dressing, but the question is it significant in the face of the global challenges? And that's not a question that I have a very happy answer to at the moment. I hope to be surprised by a happy answer, but at present I don't have it. Let's take the Indian context, because I think that kind of concretizes it. Pratham is the largest Indian NGO in the area of education. And Pratham engaged, if I remember correctly, my figures from last year, meaning 2011, because 2012 figures are not available yet as far as I have been able to get hold of them. It engaged 60,000 teachers, massive number, affecting 2.4 million children. To most people, that's kind of unthinkable numbers. Massive, obviously extremely well motivated. I don't know how effective it is. I haven't gone and looked around at these schools myself. But all the reports, and these are objective outsiders going and checking these things, including the government, by the way, which is not always very friendly to philanthropy in India. All the reports say that it's pretty good. So what do you have against it? Obviously you can't have anything against it. But the fact is that the 2.4 million people, the children that these Pratham is affecting, is nothing in the face of 400 million children in India under the age of 14. So if something is going to be done, it can only be done if government policies change. And the question is, are Indian philanthropists engaging with the government, challenging the government, as Franklin, for example, did? You may agree with him or not, you may be for pessimism, I don't know where you stand. You may think he did a terrible thing, I don't know. But the point is, he was prepared to challenge his government. Are today's philanthropists, whether in America or India, prepared to challenge their government? Are they prepared to challenge the global system the way it's developing? I don't see that. And as long as Indian philanthropists are not prepared to challenge the government, we will not get real progress in India. Not substantial progress. We will get bits and pieces happening. 2.4 million children, yes, why not? Good thing, great that it's happening. But it doesn't really change the situation. Let me give you a different example. I think it was 10 days ago, may have been 2 weeks ago, that the first X Prize for India was announced. Now, X Prizes have till now been, space and wonderful things like that. Very, very well endowed prizes, massive prizes. And the first regional prize ever is for India. Now, Ratan Tata, who is one of our foremost outstanding philanthropists, comes from a family of philanthropists. The whole independence movement was financed by them. They were responsible, this single family was responsible for the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, for the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. You could say the whole intellectual advancement of India at the highest levels could be credited, insofar as it can be credited to one party, to the Tata family. Now, Ratan Tata is a very intelligent, well-organized, highly informed man, and he's one of the trustees of the X Prize. But he and his other fellow trustees, both the other Indian trustee and the Indian trustees who are being drawn around them for the Indian prize, have publicly stated that their approach is they'll go and talk to the government and say, what do you want us to do? And whatever you don't want us to do, we won't do, and whatever you want us to do, we'll do. So we know what the government is going to say. It's going to say, if you can help the poor people, that's great, don't bother us. We want to carry on being corrupt and making money on our own. Don't bother us. You want to build a few hospitals, that's great, go ahead and do that. You come up with some tradition-based medicines, wonderful. Go and win a few Nobel Prizes based on Ayurveda, great, why not? But don't upset the apple cart. And the problem in the country is that unless you upset the apple cart in a nice way, in a gentle way, in a way that makes sense, not in the way that creates chaos. I mean, we are seeing chaos in the streets in India right now, yesterday. Unless you move things much faster than they're moving right now in India, the discontent of the people will simply boil over. And then who does it help? So our philanthropists, whether in India or in the States, are not engaging with the real problems, as far as I can see. I'm sorry, it's a very long answer. Questions, comments, stories, disagreements, please fire away. I'm sorry, I speak very strongly because I have strong views. I'm not a normal academic who says on the one hand, on the other hand. But on the other hand, I like vigorous debate. I like people who disagree with me, because I think that's how you get somewhere near the truth.
I'd just like to get your opinion on this. There are many Americans who believe that, or many people in the world who believe that rather than taxing the rich, the wealthy Americans more, that it might be effective to just close some of the loopholes that allow them to get away without paying taxes on certain things. And one of those tax exemptions is charitable donations. How would you see that playing out if we close the exemptions on charitable donations? And what would you see that balance in the future looking like if that were to happen?
Yeah. I would take your attention back to the Indian Emperor Ashoka, 3rd century BC, or the Indian Emperor Akbar, 16th century AD. There was no philanthropy, as far as we can tell, in either of those societies. But the thing is, philanthropy wasn't needed. The country was prosperous, the income gap was relatively low, there was not much in terms of war and famine and plague and all the rest of it. Everybody was happy, everybody had enough to eat and drink, everybody had a house, Why do you need philanthropy? So if you want to shut off charitable donations, please do. But the question is, what are you putting in place? At the moment, you have at least a few people who are trying to do good. 102 out of 1,223 maybe, but at least 10% of these guys are trying to do something good. If you shut off charitable donations, what do? 65% of Americans give. Will they stop giving? Some of them probably will, some of them probably won't. But the point is that as long as the basic inequality and injustice in the society remains, then it doesn't really help to cut off charitable donations. It helps if it's part of a total package which says, we will now try to build a just society. Of course, yes, great. But equally, there are tax loopholes that need to be cut for the rich. I mean, the reason why the rich have grown so rich over the last 30 years has been because the whole tax system has been weighted in their favor. And not just the tax system, but the system of subsidies. And the system of the way politics has been played in relation to all kinds of business opportunities, not least in the Middle East. That's what I was referring to when I was talking about crony capitalism. The opportunities have gone to certain individuals who are close to certain centers of power.
Okay, well, I'll just say that I would take issue with a number of things you said about the U.S. incidentally, but I'll just start, just for starters, with you said that the U.S. began as a philanthropic society since Puritan times. And I'll start just with that. You started with the Mayflower Compact, and okay, I'll go back to that. We're on the Arabella, that's the Mayflower Compact, and Winthrop, that's where he gave his City of God speech.
Sure.
And then it was just a matter of days after that he wrote back to England and talked about thanking God for killing the Indians with smallpox so that he could have this land. So I would say that this was not exactly, I mean, being philanthropic was very much a matter of point of view here, because the Puritan society, the Puritans were the most, they left being persecuted so they could be the people who persecuted, is really what is the story of Massachusetts. And so I don't see this as a...
No, and that's why I was very careful to say that they were among themselves very philanthropic. Among themselves they had this question, this tradition of brotherly love and so on and so forth. Very careful about that. Now, of course, you can always say, you can talk about America in the 60s and talk about black people. You have exactly the same situation. And even till today, in spite of a black president, we're still fighting the same issue in the United States. So you can't say that American culture has stopped being racist just because we have a black president. You know, so structural racism of that sort and those kinds of attitudes take a long time to filter out of any society, as indeed in India we have our own kinds of problem. But the question that I was putting forward was, but the proposition I was putting forward was the following. This group of white people that went to this land and settled themselves there had within themselves a relatively fair, prosperous, happy society in which there was what I call brotherly love. Now, what we have in the United States is not simply discrimination against non-Americans, illegal immigrants, and all the rest of it, which we also have, of course. But we have a society which is divided within itself, opposed within itself, so badly divided that it cannot pass even its own annual budget. That's the level of degeneration to which United States society has fallen. So the point I was making was not that the Puritans were wonderful and great in relation to the Indians. No. The point I was making was they were at least wonderful in relation to themselves.
Well,
Americans are not even wonderful in relation to themselves today.
Well, I don't think that's ever been the case, but I don't want to take up everybody's time on this, but I could certainly...
Sure. Yeah. Anyone else? Sir?
I think the most difficult problem is that in politics, one cannot do what one conscience dictates, so one has to compromise a lot of things. So how do you reconcile that with the values of philanthropy?
With the values of?
The values of philanthropy.
Well, you know, if you look back in history, in American history, you can look back in Indian history to somebody like Mahatma Gandhi, or there were various others. But obviously Mahatma Gandhi is very well known. You could look at Ambedkar, you could look at various others in the generation that fought for India's independence. You have lots of examples of people who were successful politicians, but didn't compromise their conscience completely. Were prepared to make sacrifices for the sake of their conscience, were prepared to lead the people in the direction the people did not want to go. Prepared to do that. In American history, you can look at somebody like George Washington. I mean, it was quite clear. I don't remember the man's name, but when Americans, Emperor George was talking to America and said, "What is Washington going to do now?" He said, "He's going to go back to his farm." And the emperor said, "Well, if he's going to do that, you know, he's a greater man than I can imagine," because he knew very well the temptations of power. And George Washington had the power to stay on, but he did not. He went back to his farm. And you can think of lots of examples in American history where people were prepared to do what their conscience told them to do against what the people wanted. So in other words, you have people who have no conscience, people who have such a weak conscience that for all practical purposes it doesn't exist. And you have people who may have a conscience, struggle with it, and then eventually do maybe what is wrong. It happens in politics, you have to do things that are going to be wrong. But at least you're aware of some kind of struggle of conscience. I find that less and less the case in the United States over the last 30 years. I find that less and less the case in India over the last 30 years. Now, as I say, this is simply what's happening in this generation, last 20, 30 years. This does not mean that tomorrow there isn't going to be an upsurge of values as I said, in America, you've seen swing. If you look just at foreign policy in America, you've seen swings when American policy has been very outward bound and very kind of, global in its thinking and so on. And then you've seen a counter movement when Americans have come back and been sort of little Americans again. So it's quite possible that tomorrow there'll be a swing in values, and Americans and Indians and the others around the globe will say, oh, enough of all this, and maybe Gates and Soros and Bono are part of that. And maybe Bono will have a much greater impact than even Soros and Gates, because Soros and Gates are appealing to a certain group of thousand, whereas Bono, of course, is... and people like him, there are many people like him, who are appealing to the conscience of everybody. And as long as we have a democratic system, whether in India or in the US or anywhere else, the potential for change is enormous, because you're not dependent just on one group of people. Any group of people can then take the leadership and move. That's a great advantage of a democracy, versus a dictatorship where only the leaders can move, or no movement takes place. I don't know how much of an answer that is, but I do see a decline in the quality of... We look at Abraham Lincoln. What did Abraham Lincoln do? This is where I stand. I mean, it's almost a Luther-like statement, wasn't it? The world may be against me. Business interests may be against me. The South may be against me, but this is where I stand. This is what we're going to do. So that kind of conscience, it's all pandering to business interests. It's all opinion polls and where opinion polls taking us. Is this kind of superficial stuff. Politicking rather than leadership. I think you're going to ask something. Do.
Hey, I just have one question, because you said like philanthropists such as Gates and Buffett, they are not trying to change the global system, and they have all these like initiatives, and Gates has been donating and helping all these causes for a long time. So my question is, why is it, do you think that he's not out to effect a significant change? Or why do you think, like, for such a long time, he's still donating so much money, helping so many people?
Yeah.
So what is his objective? And I'm sure he's a smart man to know that if he really wants, people to have health benefits, or like trying to work for equality, I'm sure he knows that maybe he has to challenge the government or whatever, but he's not doing that. So what do you think is going on in his mind, and why do you think all these other people are not working for global change or changing the systems?
I mean, George Soros is the only one who's done anything of that sort, unsuccessfully, but he's the only one who's engaged with real political realities. You may like him or dislike him. I'm not saying I'm a Soros man, I'm not. But that's not the point. The point is he has engaged, unsuccessfully and from a particular point of view, but he's engaged. And now, I think people, in the Indian case, people are cautious about tackling the government, because you have very powerful people who are very corrupt, and therefore you don't know which way they're going to jump when confronted with certain challenges. And you don't know what the rules of the game are, because the rules of the game at the moment have been changed so much. I mean, when Gandhiji was fighting the British, it was clear what the rules of the game were. Because it was clear what the rules of the game were, he knew how to play it. He knew that if he had the Salt March, where unarmed people were going to go against the British, to break a law that was patently unjust, clearly unjust. And if the British came down on him, that the whole of India would be galvanized at the injustice of the British. And if the British didn't come down on him, that would be great. People would say, oh, so now we have liberty to break the law. So he had the British on a hook. But what will put the Indian political leadership on a hook today like that? And if the Indian political leadership is put on a hook like that, which way is it going to react? Nobody knows. That's one thing. The other thing is, as long as Indian businessmen still have their fortunes arising from within India, they are all extremely vulnerable. We saw that already during the emergency, and people of my generation have not forgotten it. And so to tangle with the status quo in India could be extremely dangerous. We have seen people tangling with the system, and we have seen them being eliminated. And these are, of course, people not with a great deal of power. If Ratan Tata or somebody like this takes on the Indian government, privately, I'm not saying publicly, I'm not saying that he would be eliminated. But his fortunes and the fortunes of hundreds of thousands of employees in India, and indeed his company's investments in England and other countries, could be squeezed. So there is that problem. In India, in America, I do not understand why people don't take on the nature of the system. Is it that they don't understand? Is it they think it's too big? Do they think it's too complicated? I don't know. Do they just have a kind of ideology that blinds them to this? I don't know. I can only observe the facts. So I have my opinions, of course, but the facts are the facts. Please come back.
Okay.
Please attack.
No, I'll just say that, do you think that, well, you probably know, you've read Thorstein Veblen's Theory of the Leisure Class?
I'm sorry? Oh,
Thorstein,
Veblen,
yeah.
sure.
Do you think that that applies today then, that it's just that some of these people are doing this only to raise their own social standing, that's their main motivation for being the philanthropists, rather than...
No, I think, well, in some cases I'm sure that's true. Just because we know human nature, I'm sure it's true in some cases. But I don't think it's true in the case of Gates and Buffett. I think they are quite serious about it. I don't think it's the case of Bono. Bono is quite serious about it. And you can go on, several people quite serious about it.
Wouldn't you think that Clinton would be, he's pretty certainly gets politically involved.
Oh yeah, yeah. I don't know, I'm not very confident about Clinton simply because he's never admitted that he did wrong in relation to NAFTA. I mean, somebody who reneges on his electoral pledge, on a thing that's going to affect the fortunes of his nation, not some minor thing here and there. Something which has created the challenge which is the United States in front of now. It goes back to Clinton's reneging on his pledge. If there is a single incident, single factor to which it goes back to Clinton reneging on his pledge. If he hadn't done that, the whole history of the United States would have been different over the last 30 years.
I know you use NAFTA a lot here, but then you also used Canada as an example as one of the countries that's doing better than the U.S. Well, Canada is one of the ones that, that seemed a little bit inconsistent to me, that when you picked the countries that you said, which countries are, I can't remember.
I was saying where they have where they have more social mobility. Canada still has more social mobility.
But they're NAFTA.
I'm sorry?
They're part of NAFTA.
They are part of NAFTA, but they have different structures. So we were just discussing universities in Canada are all publicly funded, for example. Fees that people have to pay in Canada are much lower than the fees they would have to pay to go to a top university in the United States. I know different.
That's got nothing to do with NAFTA.
Well, no. This is the point, that social mobility is not a matter of trade agreements. Social mobility is a matter of these specific agreements or specific rules, regulations, and frameworks that allow or don't allow poor people, for example, to go to school, college, and university. So if the specific things that help social mobility were in place, then of course America would have not had the problems that it has at the moment with social mobility. It's precisely because the welfare net has been cut back in the United States, and it's still being, and will probably continue to be cut back as far as we can see. It's because of that social mobility is frozen up. And that is what is laying the groundwork for very serious problems in the United States in the future, such as we have in India. The only thing which has saved America so far from violent social revolution, given the extreme economic gaps in the United States, is the hope that I too can become president, I too can become a millionaire. But once it becomes palpably clear to the majority of Americans that they cannot become president, they cannot make their millions, then of course there will be very severe problems for the United States if it doesn't change its ways. Today 70% of Americans have no net wealth. That is the situation today in the United States.
I'm pretty aware of this.
You spoke about the politicians, and I made the point in their defense that it's after all they have to compromise. And well, you suggested the remedy that they could give up, but should they easily give up? That is one question. The other question, I'm coming back to a different angle. You also spoke about entrenched corruption. For example, in places like India and other places, the forces of integrity are frightened to challenge entrenched corruption. So what is the remedy? Should they run away, or should they face up and challenge and take the risk?
Are you originally from Sri Lanka?
Sorry? Yes,
Are you originally from Sri Lanka?
Yeah, yes.
Well, in Sri Lanka, we know what has happened.
Yes, indeed.
And so people have tried to challenge, and we know what has happened.
Exactly.
Yeah. So individual adventurism does not get you anywhere in a totalitarian type of system. But what you can do is you can, first of all, be personally straight, as it were, uncorrupt. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, "The world may go corrupt, but the line should not go through me." I'm quoting him badly, but that was the kind of point he was making. So that's the first thing. And that is a point at which, at least in India, I don't know Sri Lanka personally, at least in India, that is a point at which most Indians do not stand. So most Indians are not able to stand against corruption personally, for whatever reason. But the second thing is, if you are able to stand up personally, then you could try to mobilize other people like you around you. The reason why the massive anti-corruption movement in India has not gone anywhere is because while everybody's happy to shout against corruption, the moment the searchlight is turned on the leaders of this anti-corruption movement, it becomes clear that not everything is hunky-dory, not everything is as it should be. So of course, any movement to clear out corruption by people who are themselves corrupt is not going to get anywhere. So what is needed is self-examination by which a sufficient number of Indians move towards personal morality, refusing to compromise with the system and paying the price for not compromising with the system. And it's only when there is a sufficient number of them prepared to take a stand publicly that things will really begin to move. The reason why Gandhiji succeeded in mobilizing even his political opponents, people who disagreed with him like Nehru disagreed with him fundamentally, as you know, on economics and politics, on spirituality, everything. But the reason why Gandhiji succeeded in getting people like that, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, nationalists but of a different sort, the reason why all these people backed Gandhi was because they could look Gandhi in the eye and they knew that the man was not corrupt. They knew that if he said something, that was what was going to happen. Now, what he said may not have been, 100% according to his conscience at every point. Okay, he was a politician. Okay. I mean, a great politician, great saint in many ways, yes. He was a politician. But they knew that he was personally not corrupt. Now, when we look at the leaders of the anti-corruption movement in India, you look at the political, it doesn't matter which political party you look at, they're all corrupt. So that's part of the problem. Let me just finish by telling you a story. We are well past our time. Let me finish by telling you a story. I don't know if the story is true, by the way. It could be an apocryphal story. It's a story of a woman who comes to see Mahatma Gandhi with her son. And she says to Mahatma Gandhi, you're a great man. I'm delighted to have had the opportunity of seeing you with my own eyes. And my son, of course, I'm delighted that, but really I came to you because I have a problem with my son. This little boy loves sweets too much. He won't eat normal food. He will only eat sweets. Could you please tell him, he respects you so much. If you told him not to eat sweets, I'm sure he will stop eating sweets. Gandhiji looks at the boy, looks at her, and says, could you come back in a month's time? The woman is very puzzled. And she says, well, okay, I'll come back in a month's time. So she goes away. She comes back in a month's time and she says, Gandhiji, you remember I came month? Yes, I remember. So could you tell my son, please? Yes, I'll tell your son. So he tells the boy, I like sweets like you, but really limits and, you should. So the boy agrees that he will start eating normal food and not only sweets. So the woman, of course, thanks Gandhiji profusely. Then she says, but Mahatmaji, I'm a little puzzled. I have a question in my mind. Why did you ask me to go away for a month? You could have told him a month ago when I came. And Gandhiji says to her, you know, I love sweets too much myself. And since I love sweets so much, I couldn't tell this boy not to love sweets. So over the last month, I've disciplined myself not to eat sweets, so as to have the moral right to say to your son, don't eat sweets. Now you can say many things against Gandhi, and lots of people have said many things against Gandhi. Lots of people still say many things against Gandhi. But that character, you could disagree with the man totally, utterly, but that character is something you have to admire. Where is that character in our leaders today? Doesn't matter which political party we are talking about.
Just one point. In the case of Gandhi, he was an exceptional character. I certainly agree. A married man who was able to take the risk of sticking his neck out. But how many people with families and whose livelihoods depend upon not confronting established corruption will do that? How many people?
Well, you know, ultimately it's all
Who
a
have
question
families
of your...
to look after.
Yes, I agree. But ultimately it's all a question of your conception of yourself. You know, are you, first of all, in his case, a father, responsible for providing for family? Or you're first of all a human being responsible to
Well,
God,
I must say this,
conscience? Or
if I had not married, I would have done exactly what Gandhi did.
I'm sure there are many people who say that. Thank you, sir.
Okay, just don't tell your wife that. Okay, well, thank you very much for an interesting talk, and thank you for your questions.
The Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy.